Welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. Lindsay, Rhodes, with Sam Bruchhaus on the first day of the NFL tagging period. It starts at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Last year, 9 players were tagged. So 2 subsequently traded after they were tagged. Any idea what that number looks like this year, Sam? Any guesses?
It seems like it's going to be pretty small. And I think the reason why is because of the greater conversation that we're going to have is there's just not a lot of primo guys at primo positions that you can applicably tag. I would expect, in future CBAs, the way that the tagging structure to change because there's a lot of good linebackers on the market. Drake Greenlaw, Zach Bond.
Yep.
But you can't tag them because they're lumped in with edge rushers as well. And edge rushers are just paid at such a higher caliber that you can't realistically tag any of those players and expect to get any ROI. And it's a similar space for the interior offensive linemen, who I know there's a lot of discussion right now about Trey Smith and what the Chiefs are going to do with him. But it's just kind of an untenable situation given the way the CBA operates.
Yeah. Sidebar, they need to address that. Right?
Yeah.
Like it feels so comically outdated that linebackers include edge rushers. Like we need an edge designation at this point in time, because that's how we're designating them in terms of draft, all this stuff. It's such a different position than like a Zach Bond, who, is an off-ball linebacker. And they're such different pay scales. Same goes for, as you said, the interior offensive line. The fact that is all, like a center is in the same bucket as a left tackle is comic.
Well, the funniest item is that the reason why they're so radically different has nothing to do with their actual impact per se, descriptive on the game. It has to do with the predictability of them moving forward. And so it's tough to say whether a linebacker will play super well the next year because the linebacker has to cover, and coverage stats are a little confusing. They also have to play the run, to where if you're an edge rusher, for better or worse, you're evaluated by how many pressures and how many sacks you got, which is a counting stat. It's pretty easy to figure out if someone is getting quarterback hits on a quarterback because they are literally hitting the quarterback. It's a lot harder to figure out if a linebacker is doing his job in X system and how he will project to Y system. And so that's why we have to separate them in terms of evaluation. And it follows that we should separate them in terms of valuation, in terms of the franchise tag moving forward.
Yeah. But I think it's a particularly interesting conversation to have this year because of the guys that are hitting free agency that might otherwise have been tagged if they were if the tags were separated by position group a little bit more specifically. And we'll get into some of those names. I think that I'm with you that we're not going to see a lot of people tagged this year, going team by team. I'm just not seeing a lot of players that make sense at the tag number, and or the players who maybe make sense at the tag number on teams that might not have the money to pay that particular tag number, and it doesn't necessarily make sense for their roster build this year. The name that is obvious at this point that I think probably will get tagged ASAP is T. Higgins. Or maybe not ASAP, because there are reports that they're trying to come to an agreement about a long-term deal. But even if that's the case, they could just tag him immediately, and then they have that locked down, and then maybe they have some leverage for that long-term deal, knowing that they have him at least locked up on the 1-year deal. But I'm a little bit disappointed about that. Sorry, Bengals fans, because he was one that I thought was fun to place on other teams in free agency. And so if we have that taken away from us, then what do we have in free agency? But so it looks like T. The other question that I have is Darnold, because I think we had a lot of conversations at Super Bowl with people that kind of led us both to think that maybe a tag and trade made sense for him.
It's going to be fascinating with Darnold because he has, I think, the most paths to being acquired or re-signed than any quarterback that I can think of in recent memory, because he was good this year. In the aggregate, he was good this year. Despite the last 2 weeks, despite, kind of the inconsistent or inconclusive, more detailed analytical profile that he had, at the end of the day, he was productive and he was good, and he led a winning team that was built around him making difficult throws to really good wide receivers. That being said, the Vikings are interesting because the Vikings have an excellent roster, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. They have the two other premium positions on the offensive side of the ball already marked off. The tackles are there and they're good, particularly if Darrisaw is healthy. And they have 3 wide receivers that they believe in and a tight end that they believe in. But at the same time, a lot of other people need quarterbacks. Would they be willing to trade for a Sam Darnold person? Would they just want to go out and get him in free agency if he's not tagged? There's so many interesting things that can happen. I think a tag and trade is the safest play if I'm the Vikings, but we've seen them let quarterbacks walk before, and I don't think they're as fearful as the public media may be of letting a quarterback like Sam Darnold walk, given that they have KOC as the head coach.
Yeah, I don't even know that if at this point I'm looking at it like about a retention strategy for Sam Darnold so much as I am about maximizing what you can get for him. Like it's all
Right.
business at this point. Let's assume that they're fine with letting him walk and that's why they brought in Daniel Jones to back up JJ and that their plan is to put JJ under center next year. So then Sam Darnold is dispensable, but how do you maximize what you can get for him? If you let him walk, you're going to get a 3rd round comp pick. Can you get a 2nd round pick for him? There are so many teams that are desperate for quarterback, and it's not a great quarterback draft. And so I'm thinking that, well, let's establish this. Do you think that he's the best option at quarterback that's available this year in free agency? Because that actually kind of drives the conversation too. Is he at the top of the list of people that you would want that are available that are not in the draft?
I think that he is probably the best available option for a single year. The problem here
They're all short term, I think.
Right. They're all short term. In the draft, maybe not. Maybe you
no. Free agency.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
certainly,
in
certainly.
free agency.
I think if you want to win this year, Sam Darnold is probably the safest option, but you're cutting the ceiling off by quite a bit. But the greater problem is if you really want to believe in Sam Darnold, history tells us that, the top 15 elite quarterbacks in terms of APY are almost always drafted. So you're like really kind of limiting your upside because there just have not been that great long-term free agent quarterbacks for the obvious reason of people don't want to lose a quarterback. Yeah. So, I don't think history is on your side. I don't think the cap and really cash spending will be on your side because it seems like it's going to take like $60 to $80 million guaranteed to get Sam Darnold in your building if you're not the Vikings, and maybe even if you are the Vikings and say they don't use the tag. And that's a lot of guaranteed cash to sell your owner on when you're trying to rebuild a team, which it seems like it would have to be the Raiders or another team that's rebuilding that would go out and get him.
I have been very locked in mentally to the Raiders for some reason. I think I'm just like stuck. I've decided after going through a few options that that's the one that made the most sense to me. And now I can't pass that. I'm just like fully locked in there.
But like what, if you're Sam Darnold or you're Sam Darnold's agent and you're evaluating the situation, it seems like the Giants, which have, put a quarterback on a team with Sam Darnold. So maybe this isn't the right read on it, but I feel like I'd want to be in a situation with Malik Neighbors and the number 3 pick in the draft. How do you compare the Raiders and the Giants structurally?
I suppose I'm looking at it from a tag and trade standpoint, though. Right. And so that would take what he wants out of the equation, though that's a worthwhile conversation to have. If he is tagged and then they control where he goes, then I think it makes the most sense for the Raiders. I suppose if they do let him hit free agency, and I think the tagging period it's a 2-week window, so it doesn't necessarily have to happen today. And by the way, we're going live right now, so we're having this conversation ahead of it. You might be listening to this podcast later in an audio form, in which case this might be outdated. And so, check our work, see if we're right. But so if they don't let him go, let's see, then does that make more sense? The Giants, I mean, I like the idea of Malik Neighbors. What about O-line? How comfortable do we feel with that O-line?
That's really the question here. And I know the Raiders O-line wasn't great, but they're trying to build it from within.
They're young question is like continue to gel. They feel like
Yeah, it's a tough one. Uh, I don't know. I just think, if I'm Sam Darnold, the closest thing I can get to Justin Jefferson right now is probably Malik Neighbors. And maybe that's a simplistic way of looking at it, but also the Raiders probably have, the better coach, the new coach,
I think so.
the older coach, but a program builder who's done it all over the place. So maybe you just prefer to be with a coach that has experience. I don't know. It is an interesting problem, but like you said, it may not even matter if they go ahead and tag him.
I have already blocked out like 6 moves ahead for the Raiders. And so I think that's part of my calculus is like, well, yeah. And then they will go get a wide receiver, another one, right? And they already have a couple of good wide receivers that just aren't wide receiver ones. But like if you get a wide receiver one somehow in the draft, or I guess it would kind of have to be in the draft probably. Then Jacoby Myers and Trey, you can keep them. I have like a notion of a power slot guy slotting in there. Who is that person? I don't know, but like put that person with the tight end. And then the guys that they have on the outside, bring in a running back. You can do that later. And I don't know. I feel like I've already kind of like checked certain boxes, and with Pete Carroll there, I feel like there's at the very least going to be a certain degree of stability. I don't think they're going to be a disaster next year. And so whatever, this is a very long Sam Darnold conversation here, and we'll find out if they tag him hopefully sooner rather than later, so we know which conversation we're having. The
Right.
other thought there, though, if you're the Vikings, is do you use that tag on Sam Darnold, or are you at all interested in using it on Byron Murphy Jr.?
It very much matters on what your evaluation of Byron Murphy Jr. is. And I think
What's
they're kind of
yours?
look, our AI did not love what he did this year. And there's
Okay.
this grander conversation to be had about scheme and the way that cornerbacks play in it. But I think there's 2 numbers that really matter, one of which is one of our proprietary metrics and one of which is just like a normal counting stat. The dude was targeted the most of any cornerback in the league. And he did pretty poorly in terms of artificial intelligence metrics on those targets. Like, that's just not something that I want to see. When you're having volume at that level and you're not performing super well, despite what you're asked to do, it's typically not going to turn out well for your team. And sure enough, they were getting gashed over the middle by the Rams and by the Lions at the end of the year. And so it kind of proved itself all the way back in the preseason. This was a place of concern for Vikings fans and Vikings media members and things that people were highlighting. Brian Flores did an excellent job, but I think being a cornerback is a lot easier when you have 2 guys that are Pro Bowlers in Van Ginkel and Greenard that are getting tons of pressure, and Ivan Pace from the linebacking position, and there was all kinds of stuff going on. And so altogether, I don't think Murphy is worth the tag. I could see how they could come to the conclusion that it's a good move. However, I think the Vikings are one of the more consistently progressive in the way that they approach letting guys go. I mean, they let Danielle Hunter go last year, and Danielle Hunter ended up being a borderline all-pro this year, and it worked out swimmingly for them. I mean, the moves that they made on the backside were great. They end up getting 2 rushers instead of 1. And so that's why I'm more inclined to think they're not going to use the tag on Murphy.
What about the Eagles, who have 3 guys on the defensive side of the ball who are pretty good? We already mentioned Zach Bond and the fact that that's probably limiting the price of the tag for him. So I'm going to guess that's a no. But we've also got Josh Sweat. We've got Milton Williams. Do you see them using the tag on any of these guys, or letting them all go? And or just, negotiating further, but outside
Right.
the tag.
I think the 2 that they would have wanted to use them on would have been Bond and or Mekhi Becton. And Mekhi Becton, I don't think was an elite player, but he performed really well in our metrics, and he, was a crucial piece of a line that was just absolutely massive and took over games, including the Super Bowl. So the positional value stuff just craters. If you're going to play Mekhi Becton at guard, you can't tag him. So, and it's the
Exactly.
same way for Zach Bond at inside linebacker. Sweat and Milton Williams, I think, are more or less replaceable. in the context of the Philadelphia Eagles roster, right? Like they can go out and just draft the best players to replace them as they've done time and time again. And I also like the way that Jalen Hunt looked in the Super Bowl as well. And I liked the way that Ojomo looked at all year at the defensive tackle position. So it seems like they have the guys behind those guys to let those two walk and or press them to take a team friendly deal and, you know, go for another Super Bowl or something like that. So I think the Eagles are in a spot where, you know, they can continue being the Eagles and continue drafting the best players available and continue slotting in their young guys into positions of importance.
Are we leaving out anyone else, or are we pretty much like not tagging people this year?
Yeah, I mean, Trey Smith is the last one. I think that given people already expect him to get the biggest guard contract in the history of the National Football League, that it may make sense for the Chiefs to go ahead and transition tag him perhaps, but that also means that he's probably, you know, going to be on the move. They did this with L'Jarius Sneed last year and then traded him to the Titans. So I think altogether, number one, I don't think Trey Smith had as great of a year that a lot of people would have thought, given the Chiefs' record and their ability to move the ball. However, when you really dig deeper into it, they kind of struggled as the season went on in the run game, despite the fact being very successful. They weren't able to spring a ton of big plays. And so I think given the guard market this year is loaded, we spoke about Mekhi Becton. Kevin Zeitler is an older guy, but he's available. Mekhi Becton's another guy who's probably going to be available, all the way down to way down market swing linemen like Patrick McCary, who was in a Ravens uniform this year and performed pretty well. And that offensive line became a strength of the team. Like, you're just able to get guys for half the price that could potentially give you very similar production at the guard position. So it's tough. And again, it's tough in terms of positional value. This is a great interior offensive line draft as well. And I just don't know if it makes sense really for any team unless you're convinced that guard is the last spot you need to become a title team, which nobody comes to mind to me. But to go out and pay Trey Smith, 25, 21, 22, 23, 24, $25 million doesn't make sense to me. I know the hot name for him is the Chicago Bears. I went on a Chicago Bears podcast on Monday. It was like, I would not do this if I were them. So,
and they were fired up about that.
They were a little fired up.
That O-line, man. I mean, if you are looking at a team that's like, what must happen at a high end, but to your point, there are other options. Right. And so why pay up the highest price when you could go get somebody who is also good and whose price might be driven down a little bit just because of the number of people that are all fighting for contracts the same year, right? Like, this is going to be a tough year to max out your market if you are a guard.
Exactly. And you look at, I think what always happens in these discussions is people go and look at the Eagles and what they're spending. And Landon Dickerson is the highest, APY guard in the league.
21.
Exactly. But they just had a full, turnover of their entire defense and really hit the lotto on a lot of their draft picks.
Yeah.
And so you can do that when your entire defense has turned over and you're not paying anybody there. But then you look at a bunch of the other teams that are paying guards really highly. The Falcons, Chris Lindstrom, there were big question marks about them this year. The Panthers, who took a really targeted view of, we're going to get really good interior linemen because Bryce Young is 5'10", and we need to know if he can play.
Yep.
I think if that's the teams that need to go get the Trey Smiths, which one can say that the Bears are probably in a position to do that per se.
They might. Yeah.
But at the same time, the Bears, were probably realistically like a 7-win team if a couple games go the other direction and some field goals don't bounce off of field goal posts. And so I'm a little hesitant to do that if I'm the Bears. But like, if I'm a team that really, I have no clue what I have, then yeah, go ahead and build up the interior offensive line, build up a good run game, figure out if you have a quarterback, take some dice shots. But I just don't think it makes sense, particularly this free agency and this draft, to be spending a ton of money at this position unless you're trying to do basically what the Carolina Panthers did last year.
By the way, the transition tag number for offensive linemen, which also includes guards in this case, 22.7,
Right.
as opposed to the franchise tag number, which is 25. And as you mentioned, Landon Dickerson is the highest paid guard at the moment, 21 per year. So this, the transition tag would already put you top of market by over $1 million, 1.7. So we've talked about this a number of times already, brought up the fact that it's a very good group of guards that are available this year in free agency and in the draft. I want to touch on some of the other free agency groups and what buckets they fall in for you, so that we can kind of start thinking about free agency is going to come first. Where do we go get people via free agency? Where are we being a little bit more patient and hitting the draft? The position groups, and I'm curious to see if we have them in the same buckets here, that I separated them into a good group, medium group, and not so good group. And I have in the good group this year linebacker. I have offensive tackle. I thought about putting them in the medium group, but I think that there are people that are they're not like high end guys, so maybe they belong in the medium group actually, but they're going to get paid because certain guys that are available. I've got guards obviously in that group, and then I have wide receiver in that group, but just because there are some guys on the higher end, there's a lot of wide receivers. I mean, maybe this is true every year, but I feel like there are some wide receivers that you could plug in. It's a weird group because some of them are just like guys that I think will draw interest because of their price points, like a De'Ami Brown, who was, pretty good for the Commanders. If I was the Commanders, I might be interested in bringing someone like him back because the price point is low enough. And then you have some sort of, continuity at the position with the quarterback. There's some guys like that. Then there's guys like an older group of guys, like a Chris Godwin, who can still play, but his price maybe comes down because of injuries. Same for Steph Diggs. Keenan Allen is 32 years old, right? So, and then if you take T. Higgins out of this, maybe this bumps this entire group down to the mid group. But those are the ones that I have in as the better position groups. What do you think?
I think this year excellently shows the way that these things typically work out according to the data and just according how they've happened in the past. And I totally agree with you. I think you can get a near all pro level linebacker in free agency this year. You can go get a Zach Bond if you believe that his 1 year turnaround was fantastic. You can go get a Dre Greenlaw if you think that, his injury wasn't all the way there. I think the linebacker and the guard classes in free agency are excellent this year. You can go get really good players that can contribute for you at an immensely high level on day one, and also be like a veteran leader in your line, in your locker room. The wide receiver position, I'm going to be interesting to see how it plays out, because I think after T. Higgins, it's going to dry up quickly. And in previous years, the top 15 APY players, 0 were free agents in previous years. Like, if you have a quality top 15 guy, almost always you're figuring out a way to get that guy back. And I think that, draws the line for T. Higgins of you're probably going to have to trade for T. Higgins if you want him.
Maybe I think I'm looking at that group differently and more like guys who teams might be interested in plugging in at their price points, as opposed to there are some real studs here, which I think you're right. Like at guard and at linebacker, there are guys that you plug in, you're going to pay all of these things. You're going to go top of market. That is absolutely not the case at wide receiver. But also, how frequently is that the case at wide receiver? Because if you are a top of market wide receiver, you are not hitting free agency. It's just not happening. So we've got former top of market wide receivers who are now old, right? But maybe have some time left. Steph Diggs, I thought, played better than I thought he would last year in Houston. There's clearly some signs of drop off with his play. And then he's also coming off an injury. So that drives his price point down. But I could see a team, giving him a shorter deal, not at the top of market, but I think that they'll probably, I know how to negotiate these deals, I guess, is how I'm what I'm looking at here, and maybe why I'm thinking that they're okay. But I think you're right. Like, it's not necessarily guard and linebacker clearly in a different tier than wide receiver. So maybe I
Yeah.
should not put them in the same group.
And I think Chris Godwin singularly could be the one guy who you take a risk on and all of a sudden he's one of the best players in the league, because that's frankly, when healthy, what he's been his entire career. I mean, him and Mike Evans in no short order are great for Baker Mayfield, basically turned a quarterback's whole career around. And Baker's been excellent without Godwin as well. But the presence of those two wide receivers created situations where, Jameis Winston, despite throwing 30 interceptions, could throw 30 touchdowns as well, and created a situation where Tom Brady could just come in and win a Super Bowl immediately. Created a situation where Baker Mayfield could come off of a practice squad and become a certified starter in this league. And so I think that's the one I'd be willing to take the risk on. I'm a little concerned a little bit more about Diggs and Keenan Allen. And I think once you start getting down, DeAndre Hopkins started dropping down the Chiefs depth chart in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Similar deal for Amari Cooper and the Bills. Like, there are dart throws to be had, especially with some of these younger guys. I know people have mentioned Tim Patrick as a guy who's, sitting there at 31 years old, but was competitive for the Lions this year. It gets to the point where it's like, there is something glaring that is wrong with these people, but perhaps they could hit for XYZ reason.
I mean, there's some lower end guys who I think are interesting, again, at their price points, like Elijah Moore or a Joshua Palmer, and you're not signing them to be your, wide receiver one, certainly, and you're going to pay them accordingly, but like maybe they can fill out some depth on the right team and help. If you're not asking Josh Palmer to be a wide receiver one, then obviously that's a much better situation to be in. You've got Nick Westbrook-Akina. Like, you've got certain guys there that I think are professional receivers. So assuming you don't pay up too much for them, I agree with you that Chris Godwin's the most interesting guy, because I think he's so valuable to Tampa Bay and the continuity that they're going to need in order to somewhat protect their investment in Baker, like just what they have there on offense. You don't want to, the fact that they are losing so much on offense from a leadership standpoint. I think you want some continuity on the field. And I think Mike with Chris is your best case scenario. I mean, with the running backs. And so I wonder if he's not more valuable to them than he is to other teams, but other teams are going to be interested enough that it's going to drive the price up. And I wonder how Tampa Bay handles that.
Right. I think the question becomes, and even so to a certain degree with Chris Godwin, is what teams can hit in free agency in order to solve cheaply and without much draft capital so that they could spend it on another position of need per se, their third receiver problem, which we've talked about a lot this year. Is the idea that the research shows that sometimes, the having the third receiver is what makes an offense elite. And it may not necessarily just having the top wide receiver one, particularly if you don't have a great quarterback. I think excellent show of this was the Minnesota Vikings this year, where they just had so many things that it opened it up for Justin Jefferson and made Sam Darnold into a guy that we talked about at the top end of this podcast. Another great show of this, the Rams have two unrestricted free agents, Demarcus Robinson, Tutu Atwell. At different times in their career, those guys have been very, very productive and been, people that you look at potentially for fantasy as well. And that's just a sign that, when you get this right, it can kind of solve a lot of problems for you, specifically in terms of depth at the pass catching position.
That's another name, obviously, that we haven't mentioned because he's not a free agent, but Cooper Kupp is available. Right. So another name to throw in that mix. Some of the groups that I think are not so good in terms of the free agency class, it's so interesting to me how closely this actually correlates with the best groups in the draft. Like, it's a perfect year in that sense. Tight end, not a great year in free agency. Your best options are probably like Zach Ertz, Tyler Conklin, Gesicki, Juwan Johnson. But then it's an insane tight end class in terms of the draft. So you can go get a lot of high end guys who could start for teams. I've heard like the number 7 thrown around of people who might be able to start on different teams. So that's a very good tight end class. Defensive tackle, not a great group in free agency, but there's so much depth in the draft. Running back, same goes for that. Edge, I mean, it's kind of eerie to a degree, right? Like that these match up so closely, I
Yeah.
think.
The interesting thing about everything except for defensive tackle, because in recent years, particularly in the draft, and shows up in the Super Bowl where Chris Jones and Jalen Carter are perhaps the two most important people on the field, not named Patrick Mahomes at any given point in time, has become a premium position. That shows up in the data as well. I think only one or two people in the top 15 APY last year came to their team as a free agent. Typically, almost all those guys are drafted. The elite guys, you keep your defensive tackles. That's typically been the way teams have operated. However, tight end and running back are a place, and we saw this big time this year, where you can go and get a free agent. In fact, one could probably say that the three best running backs arguably in the league this year, Saquon, Josh Jacobs, and Derrick Henry, were all acquired via free agency. And so that's in particular a position that you can typically hit on in free agency. But I think there may be a little bit of an overreaction to that in coming years where people try to keep their running backs a little longer, despite the understanding that the Todd Gurley situation where all of a sudden the wheels come off could happen.
I mean, the running backs that are in free agency this year too they don't necessarily lend to the conversation that people want to have about the running back market, being devalued in the last few years. And so let's go get these running backs. Like, are people going to pay up for a 30-year-old Aaron Jones? Is he going to max contract? No. Najee Harris has never topped 4.1 yards per carry. And I know that people are going to be like, he's gone over 1,000 yards every year of his career. And there are going to be people that get into those kinds of counting stats. But I think the yards per carry is one that, I mean, and frankly, even people who are able to take a step back and say, like, I play fantasy. How often was he playable in fantasy? Like, I don't know that there's even a general consensus or clamor for Najee Harris going and getting a big deal. I don't think that that's true. I think maybe the most interesting guy this offseason is Nick Chubb, who was terrible this past year, coming off injury, 3.3 yards
traumatic
per
injury.
carry.
Yeah.
Right. But he's coming off a traumatic injury. So there's a part of you that's like, he's been so good his entire career prior to this past year, maybe a year removed from that injury, he'll be better. But also even that conversation is hey, we can get him at a discount because of the circumstances. And then if that hits and he is Nick Chubb of old, then awesome. But you also have to come up with a plan B in case that's not the case, because it was not good this year. He didn't look at all the same. So I think he's an interesting one. But other than that, I don't see any running backs that are going to be like, I'm here to benefit from the success that Derrick Henry had, like Saquon. Right. I don't think we're going to see that this year.
Yeah, I think the only tailbacks that I'd have a true belief in of I'm going to put them in new situation. I have not seen them be crippled by injury, and I think they will be, I can change them type vibe is Najee Harris and Rico Dowdle. And we've seen a lot of Najee Harris, like a lot of Najee Harris. Like the man has been a volume machine and he can eat up carries. J.K. Dobbins probably the high end, but very similar to Nick Chubb. Man's been injured for the better part of 3 years. Yeah. He did have a good year this year, but he was injured several times this year, and it really hurt the Chargers offense as well. Availability is the best ability, and he just simply has not been able to be available. But it does line up with the running back class, which is pretty deep, rounds 1 through 7. I suspect that Genty will probably be the only running back drafted in the first or second round. I could see it getting up to 3. There haven't been more than 3 since 2020. But I think you start getting to guys like Trevor Etienne all the way back to LaQuint Allen, who I love from Syracuse. Those are guys from undrafted all the way up to round 4 that you could be able to get and probably slot in pretty easily.
Etienne, you went full Louisiana French accent there on his name.
Yeah, that's it's ironically his name in Jeff Davis Parish in Louisiana, his name and Devon Etienne's name is pronounced the same, even though it's spelled different, which is starts going down the Louisiana tube at that point of what actually is going on.
So you don't need the pronunciation guide for those guys. You're just going for it. Okay, so those are the running backs we're looking
Right.
at. If you needed, like, let's play around with like the Raiders, because I said I
Mhm.
think that they need to go get a running back. I kind of picture them doing that in the draft. Are they a team that you think values or can afford to value the running back position early? I mean, we all know Pete Carolina's tendencies, like you're gonna want to rely on that running back a lot. So do you go get somebody in the first couple of rounds, or are you waiting and
I
plugging someone specific in,
I
considering the
think
depth?
the most analytical, like data sciencey, the people don't know what's
Which,
going
I
on.
mean, that's got Pete
Take that
written
I
all over
have.
it.
No, no, fair,
Yeah,
but take that I have is that you just cannot draft a running back in the first 2 rounds unless you
no,
are sure that they will go immediately into a scenario that they will be successful. And I think
Lions.
there's been very few that we've seen work out. I mean, like Saquon Barkley, for better or worse, did not work out for the
I agree.
Giants.
I agree.
And Saquon Barkley almost won an MVP this year. And
Zeke
so
did not work out. Like, even though
right,
he was good, even at the height of his powers, it does not accomplish what you want it to accomplish.
certainly.
Gibbs is like the outlier here that I can think of from recent years. When he was
Yeah,
drafted, I kind of melted. I was like, what are they doing? I love them so much. And they're going running back and linebacker in the first round. And it's everything I'm against in terms of roster build, but it clearly worked out for them.
right. And I think that's a scenario in which it hits and it hits well, but you have to be so confident in everything else. And despite the chagrin about Zeke, the Cowboys, I think, are uniquely set up to do this because they do have a top 5 wide receiver in the league. Depending on how Dak plays, like we've seen him be a top 5 quarterback in the league in a given season, which is better to say than most quarterbacks. And then their offensive line sneakily came along strong as the season went on last year and ended up as one of the better units there. I think that is a situation that Ashton Genty could step into. But again, I personally would not do that. I
Right.
think their defense is really bad. I think they got to fix that first. But that I think there's very, very limited situations in which you can really ask a running back to come in after drafting him highly in the first round and expect to get, number one, the value from a monetary perspective that you want to see, and number two, the production that you expect to see.
How do we feel about the safety and cornerback groups? I put both of them in the like medium free agency group. There's depth. There's depth of names that you are familiar with. We've got like different types of guys kind of up and down the board. At corner, no shutdown guys, but some good options. Otherwise, safety, no massive stars, but pretty good depth. I think maybe in the case of both of them, there are enough guys available that teams won't have to overspend for any of them, probably. So it becomes kind of an option.
Yeah, so safety is in that group with linebacker and guard where you can probably go out and get a free agent that will be highly compensated, but also will be pretty productive. And I think there's a bunch of options here. I think the number one guy here, which again, similar to the running backs, you're taking a bet that they won't get hurt, is Hufanga. If you can
Okay.
bring Hufanga in, who has a Pro Bowl pedigree,
Yep.
just is injured all the time and
All the
has been
time.
injured. I mean, like broken bones, soft tissue, like everything.
All the ways.
But he changed the face of the 49ers defense every single time he was on the field. And if you're just bringing that guy in and paying him highly, I think that's a good enough swing, given that the safety position is one where, you're not going to get murdered if your safeties aren't playing well. But if your safeties are playing well, like Hufanga can, it changes the entire face of a defense. And I think that's the one where I'm like, I think this dude, very similar to Godwin, can be a guy who is
Right.
one of the best players in the league. And thus, I'm willing to take the risk, especially if I'm either a very, very young team or a very, very, developed team that thinks I'm one piece away.
Does he get a bigger deal than Justin Reed or Javon Holland?
Justin Reed's so consistent. That's the issue. I mean, like,
and has the Chiefs, been there, done that, locker room presence. I'll show you the way to the promised land type thing that comes along.
I think it comes into how the league values the injuries, and it's always difficult to get a sense because if people in the league want someone, they typically will just go get him. Also, Justin Reed's like a little bit older. Don't know how much that makes a difference as well. But it's so tough. It's so tough with these guys, especially at a position where it's, number one, extremely hard to evaluate. Number two, extremely hard to quantify. And then number three, you have some of these questions of age, where we saw Kevin Byard, for example, go to the Bears and actually be pretty productive this year, not be terrible. And they have him under contract for another year. We'll see what they end up deciding. But I think when it really comes down to it, the All-Pro, Pro Bowl valor that we've seen from Hufanga is in excess of the years and years of consistency, but not quite the high end that we've seen from Justin Reed. That being said, only playing 17 games in the last 2 years, not ideal. I personally would take the swing on Hufanga, but I also am when it comes to the positions of safeties and linebackers, I like the wild men a little bit more. So I might be a little biased there.
What about the cornerbacks? Who's the premier guy here for you?
So the cornerback position is another one where I don't know at any given point in time if you're really able to get one in free agency. And if they are there, there's something that we don't really know about them. There's something hidden in the details that we just can't pick up on. And I think DJ Reed is probably the one. I liked how he played all year. I think if you go out and you get DJ Reed, you're getting a certified cornerback too. And if you're confident in your cornerback one, then you feel very confident about your defensive backfield. I think Carlton Davis is another one that's pretty good. Those are the two names that are really standing out to me. But again, like, Carlton Davis has been injured. There's always going to be something hidden in the details down the line. Byron Murphy is the best example of this, is someone who has been very active and very productive. Why is he hitting free agency? ? Because there's something deeper that people aren't really understanding.
What does that draft class look like at corner? Because that also impacts how we approach this.
Right. So at the top of the draft, you got Will Johnson out of Michigan, and then you got Hunter, who appears to be doing drills as a cornerback at the combine ? Like, who knows what'll happen? We thought Shedeur Sanders was going to play at the Shrine Bowl, and he was there for a day, took a couple photos, did a couple of team interviews, and dipped out. So it's always tough to know with those Colorado guys, but that's because they're highly valued, and their agents and their crew is going to make the best decision for them. But you get down to the guys like Quincy Riley, who I really liked at the Senior Bowl. It's not like the deepest position in this draft, but I think, number one, historically, if you're trying to get a long-term answer at cornerback, you have to do it through the draft. And then number two, I do think that you will be able to attack guys in rounds 1, 2, and 3 that can probably solve some problems for you.
Well, that's a nice segue to what's on tap for us next week. We are going to have so much draft content coming your way, as you and I will both be in Indianapolis for the combine. And so we'll be really heavily focused on this draft class and the questions that need to be answered down there. Before I wrap up today's show, though, I just want to quickly, because there's always news that happens the week of the combine, because everybody's kind of in the same place. I want to touch on the quarterback position just real quickly, because I think we've discussed a lot the fact that this isn't a particularly high-end draft class.
Mhm.
Particularly, we're expecting the two guys to go early, whether or not we think that, they fit the mold of guys that traditionally we would expect to go early. That's a separate conversation that we'll have next week. But like, once you get past those top two guys, Cam and Shedeur, then you're into maybe third round territory for the quarterbacks potentially. And so I think that the quarterbacks that are free agents that are older, bridge, I think that they're an interesting conversation for free agency. Like, who do you expect to actually go and get scooped up prior to the draft? Because some of these teams are just going to wait and see if they can draft one of these guys.
The only The only guy that I feel confident in that you can even make something work has to be Darnold. I mean, like
Not
I
even
just
Russell. Can't make it work.
I mean, they made it work this year, I guess, and to a similar degree, Justin Fields as well is a guy there that I think you can slot in and maybe got a little undervalued this year as well. I mean, undervalued. He's going to get probably a minimum deal or a backup level deal, so you can't get much more undervalued without being in the league. But I mean, I'm not. I don't know if I can trust in Justin Fields right now. But if I'm like, I think it's probably just Darnold, and I think as a result, that puts the Vikings in a unique position where they should probably tag him or something like that, or at least figure out how to reap the most value from him. But there are dart throws that can be had. Like if you do have a young quarterback or an injury riddled quarterback, I wouldn't be surprised if mid-season we're talking about a Justin Fields playing meaningful games. I just wouldn't want to be in a situation where that's my plan going into the season.
Yeah. Kirk Cousins is a free agent, just to kind of check the box of the other names that we have not mentioned here. Technically, well, no, he's not a free agent. He's technically still under contract. He's expected to be released, which would make him a free agent. Russell, you already mentioned. Justin Fields, you already mentioned. There's Aaron Rodgers. My hot take for this offseason is that he's this year's Bill Belichick, where there are going to be people who go, I cannot believe no one signed him. But my guess is that that's the outcome, is that he is left without the number of suitors that some people would think that an Aaron Rodgers.
Lindsay, do you think there's any Brett Favre potential where the Jets are just cursed? He goes from the Packers to the Jets, and then all of a sudden he goes to the perfect team, and he's any good. I know we've talked about Rodgers a lot, but it's so funny because that Brett Favre season with the Vikings, which as a young Saints fan at the time was very important to me because it was like a 2-dog race, and then it was one of the wildest games of all time, Favre versus the Saints in that game. But it's just funny because I think someone's going to convince themselves of that, particularly if unforeseen circumstances happen anywhere else.
The thing that makes me say no is because I don't know that we had as much data back then. And I don't know what the data would have said about Favre, right? Like what did it say after that year in New York? Was it pointing to this is him, or this is the environment and there are other issues that we need to take into consideration? I think we have so much data available to us. All the teams have all this data available to them, and it all points at not just him, certainly, but at least partially him. Like he's not a victim of his circumstances. We have enough data that at least tells us that. And then in addition to that, even if you were like, I don't care about data, I'm going to go with my gut, and I see a Hall of Fame quarterback and I want him on my team, he comes with so much other stuff. He comes with like lots of off-field baggage. And so you think about the teams that are looking for quarterbacks, and I'm like, do any of them want to plop Aaron Rodgers with all that goes on with him into this roster that they're trying to rebuild? Like, none of them are just a quarterback away. We've got teams that are like need a lot that are looking for quarterbacks. And so I would rather draft and build or take a bridge that feels a little bit safer in terms of culture. Like, I don't know. All of this is stuff I would never have anticipated 2.5 years ago would be coming out of my mouth right now, but here we are. And my guess is, and I could be wrong, my guess is that teams will say, no, thank you.
The dream chaos scenario for me, which I think might actually make our friend Sean Syed, an appreciator of Kyle Shanahan, cry, is like there's always been the rumors that the Shanahan guys wanted to get Rodgers and that he wants to go back home. Purdy's coming up, and he said that he wants to be the big dog on the block, and the big dog on the block is going to get paid $63 million. And, what would it hurt to bring in poor old Aaron Rodgers to teach him a few things? And all of a sudden you have Rodgers. I know.
Can you imagine?
It just popped in my head. I was like, oh, that would be crazy.
Because that's another element of him, is that he's not the guy who is a supportive backup. I don't know what that looks like. And maybe
he's a team guy. They'll go on a retreat. It'll be great.
Okay. I'm just gonna let that one go right
I
there.
did pull up a couple numbers though, real
Okay.
quick about
Yep.
Favre. So Favre was actually, by the analytics and by the models, and this is per NFELO, which is done by Robbie Greer, who is excellent.
Yep.
Back when I was, before I was in the media and I was a data scientist for Consumer Sports, this was an excellent resource for me. Does a lot of great public work. Real shout out to him.
Yay,
But
Robbie.
I'm looking at his starts when he was with the Jets, and they were substantially worse than his prior season for Green Bay. This is Brett Favre again. So
Yep.
again, Green Bay, Jets to the Vikings. Vikings almost wins.
What kinds of numbers are you looking at here? What was available?
So I mean, like that, we have EPA. When he was in Green Bay, he was like pretty decent in terms of EPA. He was like, had 100 plus points added, expected points added. The next year, not great. Like pretty much everything was below average. Rushing, interceptions, a lot of EPA below average due to interceptions. Air yards below average due to interceptions. And then in terms of, he has a ELO model that ranks quarterbacks based on what you would expect their impact to be on the game. It would expected that if you were just to slot an average starter in instead of Favre, the spread would have actually gone up that Jets year. So then you look at Rodgers, and he's been a little bit more average, but there's no real upside. Like he's been the same guy since 22 at this point too. He's been an average or below average starter for 3 years now, which was not the case with Favre. So I'm inclined to go with you, Lindsay, just after a quick look in the data. This is who Aaron Rodgers is now. It was just a bad situation in New York, in 2008 for Brett Favre.
But also, so one of the things that you kept saying there, without access to looking at the numbers myself, was due to interceptions, due to turnovers, so that kind of matches with his gunslinger. If you're in a situation where you're down and then you're kind of testing things a little bit more, like that wasn't Aaron's problem. It was just all of it, right? Like it wasn't like I'm down and so therefore I'm forcing this throw and then my interceptions went up and then that impacts my EPA. It was just nothing was good. Like it wasn't tilting because of something dramatic like that.
Great read. This is Lindsay, while you're the consummate professional, the absolute best, because you just knew it right off the top. I'm looking at the stats right now. Rodgers was in 22 with Green Bay was about average in terms of rushing EPA according to the versus league average. He was under average, like decreased rushing. That checks out, especially post injury. He was very immobile. Sacks was about average both years. Incompletions the exact same. Interceptions about average. Air yards very low. And it was basically all of his EPA was generated after the catch, which makes and via penalties, which he loved to throw that red line ball over and over again to Devontae Adams, and they would get some PIs. So same exact profile as you highlighted.
I'm gonna drop the mic on that, because anything that gets you to say like good point, Lindsay, like I'm good, we can't go up from there. We are going to be on, you can listen for us. I wish I knew the time right now. If I was a true professional after you complimented me for being one, I would actually know exactly when you could listen to this. But the Consumer Sports Draft Show will be on Sirius XM NFL Radio later on
7
this
p.m.
week.
Eastern on Friday.
Look at you. Drive time. Let's hit it. Well,
hey, look,
7 p.m. Eastern. We're driving on the west at that time. Anyway, Thomas will be there for that one, and we'll preview the combine. And then we'll be at the combine next week with lots of great content coming your way.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting. Last time we did Culture at the Front, Lindsay, did you watch any of the SNL 50 stuff?
Did not.
Oh, you got to catch up. You got to catch up. It was excellent.
Okay.
Some
highlights.
Excellent.
Highlight it.
The highlights were, do you know the song Dancing on My Own by Robin?
Yeah, duh.
Yeah, it's a superstar song. Yes. She did it with David Byrne of the Talking Heads. Talking Heads are one of my favorite bands, older bands from the 70s or whatever.
What's the baseball team that plays that? Is that the Red Sox that plays that song?
That is a great question.
There's a baseball team for whom that has been a little anthemic. That's all I have to add to that conversation.
Interesting. Yeah, but they did an excellent version of that. And then they also did This Must Be the Place by the Talking Heads, which is one of my favorite songs. Bad Bunny, new album came out. He did I can't remember the exact name of the song, but it's like track 2 off the album. He did a version of that. He was also on the Sunday Night Live version, which had, you know, all the best characters. It was fun. Lindsay, you got to go check it out. We'll get your thoughts next week.
I saw the Ryan Reynolds clip because, of course, everybody did. You couldn't avoid that no matter what. Like, you can't avoid Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds anywhere.
Oh, right.
Like, my entire Instagram algorithm, that's what, like, it used to be Taylor Swift. I saw everything that Taylor Swift ever did. And now it's Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni and Ryan Reynolds. And that's all my Instagram wants to show me. And I'm not interested. So I'm not clicking on it. Like, I don't care.
Hit those 3 little dots. Just put not interested.
To everyone?
Yeah.
That's my entire, what I need to do is just go click following every single time I log on so that it only shows me the things from the people that I follow. That's the thing that it like reverts to what it wants to show you every single time.
Yeah. I'm like having the reverse problem right now because of the SNL stuff, and Sabrina Carpenter was very involved, and Lady Gaga, who was very involved as well, who she's been involved in the Super Bowl. Lady Gaga's been all over the place. She's bringing us back to the good old days, reheating her nachos, as they say. But I had a comment under it was like a retrospective version of her singing Applause, which is one of my favorite songs by Lady Gaga, but it was a jazz swing band style. And because Sabrina Carpenter, that's the way she took her Grammy performance, I commented, Sabrina Carpenter, you have The Weeknd to reply. And it got like 900 likes. And so now my entire feed is only Lady Gaga and Sabrina Carpenter. So now I'm trying to like find Adam Schefter tweets to check up on the news as we're doing this podcast to make sure we don't miss anything. And it's just like Sabrina Carpenter fan edits. I'm like, this is great. This was great for the weekend, but it's time to get back to work here. Like,
I got to retrain your algorithm.
Yeah, exactly.
Just click on all of the like hardcore draft stuff, just even if you don't want to. Like, just here's what I would like for you to show me next week. Thank you.
Yeah, Jackson Dart, QB3 stuff. You know, we'll see.
Jackson Dart. There's been some stuff I've seen about him this week. Anyway, we have lots of fun conversations that we're in store for next week. Can't wait to have them as we also try the spicy shrimp cocktail at St. Elmo's, which is a must. Sam, before we started doing this podcast, suggested that he'd never heard it was unaware of the words St. Elmo's. So we're going to have to introduce him to just the concept of like, when in Indy at the combine, these are the things that you do. And me too. I've never been to St. Elmo's, so we'll check that box together.
Yeah, I'll bang out like a 500, 700 word belly review, post it on the Sumer Sports feed. You know, we'll be rocking and rolling.
You never did that from New Orleans or Mobile, so you talk a good game, but we never got any of these food reviews. So
no. In New Orleans, I had to keep it secret. New Orleans, there were people coming in after us. You got to keep it a little low key. For then, in case, I couldn't be like giving all the cards away in New Orleans in case I needed to pull one out the bag. But in Indy, everyone's there. I'm the newbie in Indy, so I can publicize all my thoughts.
All right. That's Sam Bruchhaus with the food thoughts and also the Sabrina Carpenter Instagram feed. I'm Lindsay Rhodes. Getting too much Blake Lively news. We're back again later this week, 7 Eastern on SiriusXM NFL Radio. And we'll be back with more on the Sumer Sports Show live from Indy next week. See you then.